This is Assassin's Creed Liberation. The Assassin's Creed series has always told stories about reliving historic events with slight alterations, historical conspiracies, and reliving those events through the blood and virtual lens of beloved characters. The story and character arc of Ezio Auditore, from literal birth to death. Altair Ibn Lahad and his changes from an arrogant young assassin to a wise master assassin, who would be one of the most respected within the Brotherhood. Edward Kenway and his lovable band of pirate misfits, and the list goes on. But nobody, or very little, talk about the story of Aveline de Grandpré, trying to fight back against the colonizers and get rid of the Templars, and there are many reasons for this. Liberation is one of my personal top 3 favorite games in this series. It's a standalone expansion to its sister product being Assassin's Creed 3, a fairly infamous entry. It was originally released for the Vita before being ported to PS3 and 360, and was then re-released for last-gen consoles in a remastered and slightly revamped fashion. One of the many reasons I love this game is because of the main character, the open world of 1700s New Orleans, some of the new gameplay mechanics exclusive to this game, and lastly, a little bit of the story. But it's far from perfect. For most who played through this game, the main problem that arose was the lackluster presentation, or I would say, slightly cheap execution of its narrative. But I've noticed something oddly interesting about the presentation. A certain aspect of the game that even allowed it to win a game award from a labor union that mostly represents film and TV. And that's the quality of this game's writing and storytelling. Unfortunately, what makes the writing of Liberation seem kind of hit or miss mostly has to do with its execution in voice acting, how some of the scenes are crafted, and the narrative direction. The voice acting especially does a huge disservice to the overall quality and impact of the dialogue and storytelling.
We offer 2 choices.
You give up the river,
Or we take the river.
or you suffer before you die.
3 choices then.
You dare threaten me? You bracket-faced parasite, I've no more claim here than the dung beetles.
You'd best heed thee, lady. We have you outnumbered.
Look around, old man. Your hired hands will flee at the first sign of trouble.
Aye, but the lady's temper alone could take on an army.
There are some neat narrative concepts and themes here, and I'd easily say that the story is far better than that of Freedom Cry. What Freedom Cry lacked in characters and compelling storytelling, Liberation delivers on that and feels a lot more ambitious in that part. While I will say that Freedom Cry has a very mild edge over Liberation when it comes to a coherent narrative direction and set pieces, Liberation contains some unique twists and some ideas that are exclusive to this game, and exclusive for the better. This is an introspective look into the writing and the story of Assassin's Creed Liberation. The game opens with us being thrown straight into the Animus. We're given a brief introduction to the main avatar or ancestor of Aveline. We are told that she is an assassin from the 18th century who was caught between 2 worlds, fighting to find her true purpose. Through that, we are already given a nice outline of Aveline's character and her bigger motivation that will all be filled throughout the game. The story begins with a flashback to a young Aveline and her mother, as we're introduced to the main playable setting of mid-1700s New Orleans. One thing that I kind of have to admire, even though this is for budget and limitation's sake, is how Liberation just gets straight into things. With other series entries besides the Chronicles trilogy, opening with a decently lengthy linear prologue, where we're only properly introduced to the character and main playable sandbox about 10 to 20 minutes in. Liberation just drops you straight into the story and the world you'll be spending about 10 to 20 hours in, with the main character being introduced within the first 2 minutes of starting a new playthrough. Anyways, Aveline gets separated from her mother, and we get to see the world and themes of the game, with slave auctions and merciless colonizers. We see Aveline's mother almost without a care in the world, leaving a young Aveline behind, near a slave auction. This intro might be a bit goofy due to its execution, but is a little bit clever on paper. It somewhat paints Aveline's mother as somewhat of an antagonist, the first kind of antagonism we see in the game, because in a way she is, personally. Aveline is given a momentarily confusing and personal conflict, as her mother just coldly abandons her, showing no worry in her body language. We transition to an older Aveline, still in a supposed flashback, but this time it's a bit surreal. An 18-year-old Aveline wakes up in the present time in panic, revealing that it was just a nightmare but still a flashback nonetheless, except for that last one. We're introduced to Aveline's new mother, Madeleine, who I'll be referring to throughout the rest of the video as the Madame. It's stupid, but I like it. The Madame seems to be a caring and genuinely loving motherly figure to Aveline, showing that she is in safe hands. The introduction of the Madame also means that Aveline belongs to a family of a different descent, a family that slaves would frown upon. Also, when Aveline wakes up and the Madame arrives to comfort her, her dialogue also informs us that this nightmare is a recurring thing.
Aveline? Ma chérie, you were shouting again. Was it the nightmare?
Oui, only a dream. I'm sorry to have woken you.
Meaning that Aveline is still quite distraught at this event, and she even hopes that her mother hasn't forgot about her. Aveline secretly dresses into some assassin gear, which is when we're introduced to the two worlds that was mentioned in the very beginning of the game. That of a secretive assassin, and that of a young woman part of a wealthy and formal family of colonizers. Aveline heads to get some fresh air and scales the tallest tower of the city as the opening title begins to roll, and the opener isn't concluded. The opening, professionally known as a cold open or teaser, is quick, straight to the point, but effective. We're loosely given what we need to know about the main character right off the bat, and through a flashback sequence we're introduced to the world and a personal character conflict that carries some mystery to it. The mystery being the question of, why did Aveline's original mother abandon her to be taken a slave? Something interesting about this character conflict is that the story basically treats this as a subplot, meaning that we're introduced to a subplot within the very first few minutes of the game. Just something interesting I noticed. We then begin the first act of the story, where we are introduced to the rest of the primary cast and some world building is done. We meet Gerald, who is an accountant and a member of the Brotherhood in Louisiana, who also shows romantic interest in Aveline. When we head to the Bayou, which is the game doing some world building as we're shown a different side to New Orleans and we see a new faction, we're introduced to Agate, Aveline's mentor and one of the better characters of the game. Lastly, we meet the two heads of an ally faction known as the Smugglers, Elise and Roussillon. The current plot sees Aveline having to stop the colonizers and the Templars from completely taking over Louisiana, and then finding a former assassin who's helping the Templars. During this plotline, we're first introduced to one of these secondary antagonists, a Templar named De Ferrer. When he's introduced, he comes off as calm and collected with a hint of strictness. He's one of the better characters in the game because of his persona, some of his dialogue, and the voice acting to back him up.
My, Governor. I fear the air of conspiracy has gone to your head. We'll make good on our promise, so long as your end of the bargain is kept.
Everything is under control.
We're also introduced to one of De Ferrer's special traits, his ability to manipulate. De Ferrer can manipulate those of a higher power and a lower power with relative ease. I like to call him a false promiser. He promises to offer, reward, or do something for his targets, but they never get the chance to realize that they are being used for his own gain. Because in a way, Aveline cleans up De Ferrer's mess without knowing it, which is something he even brings up later on. This character introduction alone made me intrigued by his character, making him one of my favorite antagonists in the series. In fact, he kind of reminds me of Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, both in his looks and to a lesser extent his personality. When Aveline and Elise head to where Baptiste, the former assassin I mentioned earlier, is located, Aveline asks about Elise's background on the way there. Through this exposition, we're given a decent insight into Elise as an overall character. We learn that she is very close to Roussillon, and we also witness a bit more of her personality that we hadn't seen before, making her seem a little more like a teenage girl than we might have thought. Just some quick character building at the right time. Soon after this, we first meet the character of Baptiste. A little bit more on this segment. The writing here nicely and quickly builds and fleshes out his character, especially since his screen time is very limited. There's visual context, and his two different moments of dialogue show his character in two different positions of power. In the scene with the Ferrer, Baptiste is a lower power and a mere pawn who's just following orders. But during the ritual, we see his character in a leadership role. He speaks with pride and intimidation. This shows that Baptiste is both a loyal character to his higher-ups and a convincing leader to those below him. The dialogue between Baptiste and the Ferrer also introduces a narrative gimmick this game has, known as the Citizen E memories. Citizen E is basically a program that a hacker known as Erudito has installed into the Animus. There's a select few cutscenes that have been altered to make the Templars look good or to hide some sensitive information. Citizen E basically shows you the real cutscene with some previously cut out dialogue now available for your ear's pleasure. In this cutscene's case, it begins with the Ferrer talking about Baptiste making good on his word. What this means in the Abstergo cut is unknown, but in the Citizen E cut, this alludes to Baptiste joining the Templar Order after taking out the nobles or higher-ups who control New Orleans.
The nobles of New Orleans shall perish by poison, and the slaves shall be avenged. My mentor's work will be complete.
And control of the river will fall to those who know what to do with it.
Then I will be inducted into the Templar Order.
As agreed, if you make good on your word.
Aveline kills Baptiste during the ritual, but during the fight, we get some important information.
Ah, your blowpipe. A beautiful weapon. One of the finest I ever made. I remember the day that coward Agate stole it. Fitting he should remain too spineless to face me. But I have captured his pawn. Now he will be forced from hiding.
Baptiste reveals that his mentor was a man named Francois Macandal, and Agate was one of his disciples. He also decides to play an important pronoun game within some exposited backstory that involves Agate. Baptiste mentions a woman who betrayed him and Macandal as well as stole from them. Baptiste notices Aveline's locket and says how it looks familiar to the one that the woman stole. Baptiste dies with this woman's identity still unknown, but Aveline is eager, reminding us of the subplot to find Aveline's mother. And that pretty much wraps up the first act. Things start off quite strong in this first act, at least when it comes to its storytelling and writing. There's quite a bit of setup in terms of characters and subplots that nicely unfold and build up to something bigger. There are also some nice ways that the story fleshes out its characters. This first act also comes to show that the story is a bit more complex than you might have thought. And as you'll see in Act 2, there's a lot going on throughout the story and it has a lot going for it. Before I begin with the second act, I also want to talk about this game's dialogue a bit. Admittedly, the dialogue is pretty good. The way it's written feels mature with pleasant wording without feeling excessively mature or too fancy. No line feels wasted and they always serve some kind of purpose, whether it's for pushing the narrative forward or not. Whether it's informing the player, fleshing out the characters, fleshing out the world, setting up a subtle mood or creating some character drama. But again, the voice acting does a huge disservice to this, resulting in some cutscenes feeling a little bit unequal, especially in the third act. That aside, I also want to mention how each character is written. Almost each line of dialogue feels unique to their respective speakers. This nicely fleshes out the personality and even the current mentality of each character. It's how they present their lines and how they utilize their choice of words that make it feel unique to them. meaning that most of their lines would sound very off coming from another character. And there's even a cutscene that does this, and it's just awkward.
I like how you think. Have I not said it before, Elise? I love how she thinks.
Roussillon, I like how you think. Have I not said it before, Elise? I love how he thinks.
Now, I will admit that the game lacks any memorable lines or pieces of dialogue that sticks out to me like in other games, and it's an aspect of the writing that feels a bit overlooked, which ends up making the overall writing a bit forgettable after the fact. So Act 2's plot goes a little like this. Aveline heads to Chichen Itza, or the Mayan ruins, where we first hear of a so-called company man. The Templars are also looking for the pieces of a prophecy disc, and Aveline is to find them before the Templars do, while also looking for the company man. During all this, Aveline's father mysteriously becomes ill and dies on his deathbed. During this act, we're introduced to a new plotline that'll be taking center stage for pretty much the rest of the game, finding the company man. During this, Aveline also needs to find all the pieces of the prophecy disc before the Templars do. And just like that, we're faced with two goals that have some stakes and that need to be solved quickly. In the process of this, we also run into Aveline's mother after killing de Ferrer, my favorite antagonist gone too soon. It's also this moment where we revisit a question that was set in the cold open of the game. Why did Aveline's mother abandon her to be taken a slave? Now, admittedly, the answer that we're given doesn't really matter because it's written in a way that kind of muddies up the answer and it doesn't even leave that much of an impact. This whole scene just feels like it's holding back, which is not a good thing. But the subplot of finding Aveline's mother only truly ends after finding the second piece of the prophecy disc in Chichen Itza, as Aveline is about to head back to New Orleans and her mother decides to stay to protect the plantation from the Templars. Skipping over some events, Aveline is tasked by the Madame to help escort a former slave named George Davidson. We'll come back to this character a little bit later though, but what I want to talk about is probably one of my favorite sequences of the whole game. Going to the ball party to assassinate Vasquez with the assumption that he's the company man. Turns out he isn't the company man, but what I love about this whole sequence is the little bit of world building, the cinematography, the backdrop, and what happens at the end of the sequence. We get to hear stories and conversations about how the colonizers feel about everything that's going on, as well as their loved ones. Because up to this point, we've mostly been focusing on the Templars. We also get to see Aveline fully taking advantage of her formal side, as we get this nice little dance scene that honestly should have been longer. It's kind of fun to watch. But at the end of the sequence, after killing Vasquez, the Madame shows up in disappointment and tells Aveline that her father has passed. But the way the Madame's dialogue paints the scenario makes Aveline kind of look bad. She seems to be having fun at a mansion party while her father is dying on his deathbed. It's nothing spectacular, but it's a good sequence. Aveline and Connor Kenway from Assassin's Creed 3 group up and go through the snowy frontier of New York to find the company man. George Davidson, the former slave that Aveline escorted, turns out to be an officer for the Templars. It's a small and unexpected twist, especially when you think of the themes of the game, and Davidson's much smaller character that we first meet in Sequence 7. Davidson's dialogue purposefully contradicts the themes of slavery and freedom. He talks about him being free under the order of the Templars, but he doesn't realize that being a man of his skin complexion in a time like this won't get you freedom, and Aveline even points this out. This also fleshes out the Templars' ability to manipulate people, also harkening back to de Ferrer. A good example being the Citizen E cut of de Ferrer's conversation with Baptiste, where they talk about Baptiste, a man of a dark skin complexion akin to slaves, being accepted into the Templar Order. It's twists like these that make Liberation's story progressively intriguing. This is some good writing. Anyways, Aveline defeats Davidson, but he reveals that he's not the company man, but that the company man is Aveline's own stepmother, the Madame. Therefore, concluding the second act. Act 2 is packed with promising moments, some depth, and a lot happens here. Stakes are slowly raised with each assassination of a supposed company man, Agate being in danger, which is something I forgot to mention, as well as having to find all the pieces of the prophecy disc before the Templars do. It kind of felt like I was playing an adaptation of an Assassin's Creed novel, because of the complexity of the narrative and the thrills of the twists. There are some nice subtle twists that get the momentum of the story going as it gets compelling and progressively intriguing. This is where the story feels like it's really getting good. Now I will say this, the third act is kind of a mess. Things just happen so quickly and different storylines end so abruptly, including the main storyline. It feels rushed and poorly put together when it shouldn't be, resulting in the final chapter leaving me a little bit conflicted with my love for the earlier parts of the game. Everything before Sequence 9 is quite solid, fairly paced, and more than decently thought out. Sequence 9 on the other hand is just poor. The only thing saving this final act is the climax, and it's quite a deep one. So it turns out the company man was the Madame all along. She's also the one behind Evelyne's father's poisoning, and since she's the company man, that means she's obviously a Templar. It's a twist that feels well deserved, because everything that you've done that required the help of the Madame was for her own, as Evelyn would say, ill gain. And trust me, we need the help of the Madame quite a bit in this game. She can see right through Evelyn, knowing about the Brotherhood and what she does at night, and she uses this to her advantage, secretly using Evelyn to get what she wants, making it seem like Evelyn is still somewhat a slave, because hypothetically, she kind of still is. She's just a slave held in a higher regard and in a much more fortunate position than others. At the beginning of the story during the cold open, Evelyn was left at a slave auction and taken by this new family with her original father and stepmother, who happened to be colonizers. The exact same colonizers we've been fighting throughout the game. So we're basically fighting the people of Evelyn's parents. This could also be the reason how the Madame knows about Evelyn's activities and association with the Brotherhood, and uses that to her advantage, resulting in the Madame tasking Evelyn to escort an undercover Templar, being George Davidson. To add to all this, at the beginning of this twist, the Madame even points out some things that make Evelyn and even the Brotherhood look distasteful, bringing up questions on the morals of the Brotherhood, which has come to mind in many Assassin's Creed games. The Madame even mentions how they're alike, because they very much are. They both live in two worlds but have an opposition to one another in their other world. While Evelyn is caught between the world of a formal lady and an assassin, the Madame is in the world of a formal lady and a Templar. They are literally on the same boat, head to head. All of this adds a lot more much needed weight and depth to this twist, and also neatly plays into the themes of the game. It leaves you to think deeper about the situation, because on the surface, this seems like a regular plot twist kind of thing. But when you actually think about things hypothetically and look at the messaging in between, it's a much heavier moment. Now that I said all of that, this is probably one of the more deeper moments of the game. This is some good writing. If the voice acting was just better, this could be a somewhat Shakespearean moment. But what follows after this twist and for the rest of the story here on out pretty much kills any and all momentum this game's story had up to this point. As you think things are about to get a bit wild and exciting, it immediately starts crashing down. It's wild, for sure, but for the wrong reasons. Let's begin with an odd moment that starts immediately after this twist. It's a moment that sticks out to me like a sore thumb and a poorly executed conclusion to one of the better characters of the game, that being Agate turning against Evelyn. This moment was clearly rushed and just ended up feeling odd at the end of the day. It's weird because there was a build up to this moment, as Evelyn stopped obeying Agate's orders slowly but surely, and Agate even had dreams of Evelyn turning against him. Yet this moment still manages to feel like it came out of nowhere. It feels cheap, and to add to this, Agate also just commits suicide, and this scene just feels very left field. And there are even some character inconsistencies I just don't feel like talking about. It's just a weird scene. This leads us to the last two missions of the game. Evelyn heads to where the Templar Order settles, and the Madame accepts her into the Order after giving her the completed prophecy disc. And then the game ends. or at least that's what Abstergo wants you to think. Through these fake credits, you can even see that some, or possibly all, the names are those of Abstergo employees. What makes this even more apparent is the very last given credit, Consultant Riddick, obviously referring to Riddick from the first two games. Anyways, the credits are cut short as we're taken to an alternate Animus simulation. This is Erudito's doing, as we have to assassinate the Citizen E to get the real ending. In the real ending, Aveline hands the Madame a fake prophecy disc and a battle ensues, killing the Madame in the process. Aveline then uses the real prophecy disc and is shown a holographic recording from the first civilization, and then the game just ends abruptly. It's just such a rushed and anticlimactic conclusion to a story that started off strong and developed into something promising, only to end so abruptly and awfully. At least the first two acts were good enough to slightly overshadow this cheap finale for me. The climax is where this game's narrative potential just ends. Anything after it just makes things unfortunately sour. I don't even know anymore. Liberation has some impressive writing for the most part. There's some solid world building, characters are nicely fleshed out, the themes of the game are nicely implemented into certain narrative moments when you least expect them, such as some of the twists, and Aveline ends up being a solid character at the end of the day. She's one of my favorites in fact. She's a three-faced character with clear and reasonable goals, a likable personality, and a decent character arc. She's flawed and sometimes uses those flaws to her advantage, making her an entertaining and memorable character, even if the Madame highlights some of the bad parts of it. But like I say multiple times, the mediocre voice acting just gets in the way of the overall story. It muddies up some of the messages and they become less impactful because of it. Other than that, the dialogue and the world itself makes Liberation's story feel diverse and somewhat colorful. It's one of my favorite parts of the game, with it being one of the reasons why Liberation is my third favorite Assassin's Creed game overall. Add to the fact that the soundtrack that gives Jesper Kyd a run for his money, not really, some of the gameplay, and the nice cinematography for what was originally a handheld game makes Liberation feel like a diamond in the rough. It feels unequal but still contains some charm that I love this game for. Whether you like Assassin's Creed Liberation or not, it still deserves some credit and a bit of praise. And with that, I'll leave you guys to do your own thing. I appreciate those who've given this long and complex video a shot, since it's on a pretty forgotten game and I'm digging into the deeper, more niche ends of it, but I want to thank you guys. This video was an absolute nightmare to write for, and the editing was also a bit of a challenge, mainly due to some obstacles. But I'm just glad it's off my hands now and I can finally rest. This video was actually supposed to come out just before Christmas, but with so many rewrites and re-records, I just couldn't make that date. Anyways, stay safe, stay entertained, take care, and take it easy. Also, Happy New Year. Cheers.